Lacey Fletcher was a young woman who at first glance could have been just another face in a small, tight-knit community in Louisiana. Born in 1989, Lacey grew up with a family who loved her. But as she matured, things began to take a dark turn. Diagnosed with autism at a young age, Lacey's life would soon be shaped by her struggle to communicate, her need for constant care, and a growing sense of isolation. She never fully integrated into society in the way many of us take for granted. However, what should have been a loving, compassionate environment turned into a nightmare of neglect that would ultimately cost her life. In 2022, the community of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was rocked by a revelation that seemed almost too horrific to comprehend. Lacey Fletcher, at the age of 33, had been found dead in her home under unimaginable conditions. Lacey had spent the final years of her life literally stuck to a couch, her body deteriorating to a shocking degree. She was discovered after years of apparent isolation, with little to no outside help, in a situation that can only be described as extreme neglect and abuse. How did a young woman, full of potential, end up in such a tragic and preventable situation? How did her parents, who were supposed to protect and care for her, allow this horror to unfold under their own roof? The case of Lacey Fletcher has sparked outrage, sorrow, and an examination of the failings within the healthcare and social systems that were meant to protect vulnerable individuals like her. Today, we will delve deep into the tragic story of Lacey Fletcher, piece together the events that led to her untimely death, and explore the heart-wrenching realities of abuse, neglect, and the system's failure to act. This is a case that transcends simple crime. It is a stark, painful reminder of the consequences of ignoring those most vulnerable among us. In this first part of our investigation, we'll introduce you to Lacey's life before the horror unfolded, the struggles she faced, and how a seemingly normal family began to unravel behind closed doors. Through interviews, police reports, and the heartbreaking details of her condition at the time of her death, we'll begin to understand how this young woman was left to die in such inhumane circumstances, shedding light on the cruelty that could occur in a place meant to be her sanctuary. Lacey Fletcher's death is not just a story of personal tragedy. It is a story that asks us as a society to examine how we care for our most vulnerable, how we overlook the signs of abuse, and how justice failed a woman who, at the end of the day, only needed love and care. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind this harrowing case in Part 1 of the tragic death of Lacey Fletcher, a story of neglect and betrayal. Part 1, The Life of Lacey Fletcher, a young woman with great potential. Trapped in isolation, Lacey Fletcher was a bright young girl full of promise, but her life took a tragic turn that would haunt the small community of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Born in 1989 to Clay and Sheila Fletcher, Lacey's early years seemed to reflect a typical childhood. Like many children, she experienced milestones learning to speak, form relationships, and grow into her identity. However, as she entered her early teens, Lacey's life would begin to look different from those of her peers. Diagnosed with autism at an early age, Lacey struggled to communicate and to connect with the world around her. The diagnosis and its impact at the age of 2. Lacey was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, ASD. Autism is a developmental disorder that affects how a person perceives and interacts with the world, and it often comes with challenges in communication, social interaction, and repetitive behaviors. For Lacey, the diagnosis would mark the beginning of a lifelong struggle. Early signs of autism included difficulty speaking, social withdrawal, and sensory processing issues. As Lacey's parents, Clay and Sheila Fletcher, received this news, they were understandably devastated, but they tried their best to provide Lacey with the care she needed. While many children with autism thrive with early intervention programs and therapy, Lacey's journey was different. The Fletcher family, although loving, began to experience increasing difficulties as Lacey's needs grew. The decision to keep her at home and provide her with care became more of a challenge with each passing year, particularly because Lacey's symptoms worsened as she got older. Her inability to communicate, coupled with behavioral issues, made it difficult for her to fit into typical schooling or social settings, further isolating her from the outside world. While Clay and Sheila, as parents, undoubtedly loved their daughter, they may have underestimated the long-term consequences of Lacey's condition. Instead of seeking outside assistance, such as professional caregivers or social services that could have provided a greater level of care, the Fletchers chose to keep Lacey at home in an environment they considered more controlled and comfortable. For her life at home, the isolated world of Lacey Fletcher, by the time Lacey reached her teenage years, she was becoming increasingly withdrawn. Her social circles were non-existent, and while some of this could be attributed to her autism, the lack of outside interactions compounded her isolation. Instead of reaching out for help or creating opportunities for her to interact with the world, her parents continued to maintain a secluded environment. Their home became Lacey's world, and unfortunately, it was a world that only grew smaller as the years went on. Lacey's inability to verbally communicate made it increasingly difficult for her to express her needs and emotions, leaving her in a constant state of frustration. Her parents' method of care, while certainly born out of love, was ineffective. Their solution was to shelter her from the outside world entirely, keeping her in the confines of their home, a decision that would ultimately lead to devastating consequences. They believed that by keeping her inside, they could manage her environment and provide a semblance of control over her difficulties. However, what they failed to realize was that this lack of engagement with the outside world left Lacey severely neglected and vulnerable. Lacey's home life became her prison. The family lived in a modest suburban house, but the once vibrant space would soon be reduced to a setting marked by isolation, inaction, and a complete lack of external support. Over time, Lacey's behavior became more difficult to manage. She grew more sedentary, and her physical health deteriorated as she became increasingly dependent on her parents for everything: feeding, hygiene, and movement. She spent most of her time on the couch, a place that would become central to the tragic circumstances of her death. Though Lacey's parents claimed to be providing her with the care she needed, their understanding of what she required was tragically limited. Without proper therapy or socialization, Lacey's health, both physically and mentally, began to deteriorate. It is crucial to understand that as Lacey's condition worsened, her situation was not one of intentional cruelty but rather one of overwhelming neglect. Sheila and Clay, in their limited capacity, failed to recognize the gravity of their daughter's needs and the harmful consequences of their inaction. The symptoms of extreme neglect. As the years passed, Lacey's physical condition began to spiral out of control. The young woman, who had once been full of life and promise, was now a shadow of her former self. Her appearance drastically changed as she became more sedentary, spending day after day on the same couch in their living room. Her physical health deteriorated at a rapid rate. The muscles in her legs and body weakened due to lack of use, and her body became increasingly covered in sores and wounds from sitting in the same position for extended periods of time. What truly stands out about Lacey's situation is how she was allowed to reach this point of extreme neglect, where she became physically stuck to the couch she sat on. Lacey's skin began to deteriorate, forming deep sores and ulcerations from being sedentary for such prolonged periods. Her hair became matted, and she was unable to maintain even the most basic standards of hygiene. Her personal care needs were ignored or overlooked, as her parents failed to take the necessary steps to ensure she was receiving medical attention and the support she so desperately needed. Though Lacey had a condition that required attention and care, her situation should not have led to this extreme form of neglect. The symptoms of her isolation: physical deterioration, malnutrition, untreated wounds, and a complete breakdown of her personal hygiene were all signs that something was terribly wrong. But despite the obvious indicators, the Fletchers did not seek help. Instead, they continued to provide minimal care, feeding her at irregular intervals and offering very little physical or emotional stimulation. Over time, the condition of Lacey's health worsened dramatically. She had developed severe bedsores, and her body had begun to break down under the weight of neglect. The couch became not only her resting place, but also her confinement. Lacey's body essentially melted into the couch, as she remained stuck in place, unable to move or care for herself. The horror unfolds Lacey's final moments. Lacey's extreme isolation continued for years, with no one outside of her immediate family intervening. No outside agency or medical professional was called upon to assess her condition or offer support. The horror of Lacey's death unfolded. On January 3, 2022, when authorities were finally alerted to her situation, a call was made to emergency services, and what they discovered was nothing short of grotesque. Lacey's body was found decomposed, her skin literally melted into the couch she had been sitting on for months. She was emaciated, and it was clear that she had been neglected for a prolonged period of time. Her parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, initially claimed they didn't fully understand the severity of Lacey's condition. They argued that Lacey had been reclusive and that her condition worsened gradually over time. They even tried to explain that Lacey had been avoiding food and drink, which was why she had deteriorated. However, this defense seemed weak and inconsistent with the physical evidence found at the scene. What was truly horrifying about Lacey's case was that it was not an isolated incident, nor was it a momentary lapse in care. It was a long-term process of abandonment, neglect, and complete failure to intervene. The sheer cruelty of allowing Lacey to remain in such a dire state of health, without any consideration for her well-being, was a blatant violation of her rights as a human being. The physical condition in which Lacey was found left investigators shocked and disturbed. It was a situation that no one should ever face, especially not someone like Lacey, who had been born into a family that, on the surface, appeared to care for her. Yet, the harsh truth was that the negligence displayed by Sheila and Clay Fletcher ultimately sealed Lacey's fate, leading to a tragic and horrifying end. The first signs of justice following the discovery of Lacey's remains. The authorities began their investigation, and the full extent of her neglect began to come to light. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were arrested, charged with second-degree murder and cruelty to the infirm. The public outcry over the case was swift and powerful. People were horrified by the images and details that emerged during the investigation. And Lacey's story began to gain national attention as the ultimate case of neglect and abuse. As the case progressed, it became clear that Lacey's life had been marked by a series of tragic missteps by her parents. Rather than providing her with the support, love, and professional care she needed, they had essentially abandoned her to rot in an environment of neglect. Sheila and Clay Fletcher's failure to act, their refusal to seek help, and their inability to properly care for their daughter would haunt them in the legal process that followed. Lacey Fletcher's story became a powerful symbol of the consequences of neglect and abuse. While the investigation was still ongoing and the legal proceedings were just beginning, the case ignited discussions across the nation about the systems in place to protect vulnerable individuals like Lacey, and the dire consequences of ignoring warning signs of neglect. Conclusion of Part 1. The tragic story of Lacey Fletcher is one of profound neglect. A horrifying example of how a lack of intervention, love, and responsibility can lead to unspeakable suffering. Lacey's death was the result of a failure to provide her with the care she needed, leaving her physically and emotionally trapped in a world of isolation. Her family, in their misguided attempts to protect her, only condemned her to a life of misery. In the following parts of this investigation, we will delve deeper into the investigation that uncovered the truth behind Lacey's tragic end, the legal ramifications for her parents, and the lasting impact on the community. We will also explore the broader conversations surrounding the protection of vulnerable individuals, and how systemic failure contributed to Lacey's devastating fate. Stay with us as we uncover the painful truth behind the tragic case of Lacey Fletcher, Part 2. The investigation uncovering the truth behind Lacey Fletcher's death. The discovery of Lacey Fletcher's body in January 2022 was just the beginning of a long and harrowing investigation. What initially seemed like a tragedy of neglect quickly transformed into one of the most shocking and disturbing cases of abuse in recent years. The sight of Lacey's decomposed body, physically fused to the couch she had been sitting on for months, would haunt investigators and the public alike. What was initially a suspected case of neglect soon turned into a deep dive into a story of systemic failure, emotional neglect, and a horrifying lack of responsibility. The immediate response, first glimpses of the horror when emergency services responded to the call from Lacey Fletcher's parents. They were unprepared for the grisly scene they would encounter. Lacey was found in a condition that was almost beyond comprehension. Her body had deteriorated so severely that it appeared as though her skin had melded into the fabric of the couch. Her posture indicated that she had been sitting in that exact spot, in that same position, for a long, long time. There was no sign of movement, and her legs were withered and atrophied. The stench of decay was overpowering, signaling the extent of the neglect she had been subjected to. The medical examiner, who arrived at the scene, later reported that Lacey had likely been sitting in the same position for months without being able to move. The cause of death was attributed to complications from long-term neglect, which included a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and severe untreated bed sores. But the shocking part wasn't just the state of Lacey's physical health, it was the complete and utter disregard for her well-being that had led her to this point. Her parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, were immediately taken into custody. Their behavior, upon discovering their daughter's condition, was alarming. Rather than expressing deep concern or regret, Sheila and Clay seemed numb, their reactions muted and disconnected. This lack of emotional response, or even an attempt at an explanation, raised immediate red flags. Authorities began to suspect that the situation had been far worse than they had initially imagined. The parents' statements, conflicting accounts, and inconsistent behavior. The hours and days following the discovery of Lacey's body, Sheila and Clay Fletcher were questioned by the police. The investigation began with them providing what seemed like an incoherent narrative about Lacey's condition. They claimed that Lacey had withdrawn into herself over the years, choosing to isolate herself on the couch where she spent most of her time. According to Sheila and Clay, Lacey had not been eating much or interacting with them, which they attributed to her autism and mental health struggles. They also suggested that Lacey had refused to move, essentially choosing to stay in the same place, but these statements quickly began to unravel as investigators dug deeper. The couple also claimed that they didn't realize the full extent of Lacey's condition. They suggested that they had tried to provide care but were simply unable to manage her needs. However, the evidence in Lacey's condition told a very different story. It was clear from the wounds on Lacey's body, the severe weight loss, and the presence of sores that she had been suffering for an extended period. Her body had been left to deteriorate without medical attention or even basic Quran action, or lack thereof, that went far beyond any reasonable explanation of refusal on Lacey's part. Furthermore, investigators found that Lacey had been receiving minimal care in the months leading up to her death. Despite the fact that she had severe medical needs, including pressure sores, dehydration, and possible infections, the Fletchers had failed to seek medical help or social assistance, which was a key point of the investigation. Sheila and Clay continued to insist that they had done everything they could, even as forensic evidence suggested otherwise. The coroner's findings, a horrific picture of neglect. Lacey's autopsy revealed the true horror of her final months. Medical experts confirmed that Lacey's body was in a state of severe neglect. She weighed just 86 pounds, and her body had suffered extreme atrophy from lack of movement. Bed sores covered her back, hips, and legs, and some of the sores had become so infected that they had caused deep, open wounds. These were the kinds of injuries that should have been attended to long before they reached such an extreme stage. However, Lacey was never taken to a doctor or a hospital for care. There was no sign of any intervention to address these wounds. No indication that her parents recognized the severity of her physical condition until it was far too late. The coroner also found evidence of malnutrition and dehydration, both of which contributed significantly to her death. Lacey had likely gone days, if not weeks, without adequate food or water, which further exacerbated her physical decline. The lack of any significant medical intervention to treat these issues was shocking and revealing. It became clear that this was not just a case of neglect, it was a complete disregard for Lacey's health and well-being. What made the situation even more disturbing was the fact that Lacey was not a child or even a young adult who might not have been able to express her needs. While she was nonverbal due to her autism, she was still a human being with basic needs, and it was the responsibility of her parents to care for her. The negligence exhibited by Sheila and Clay Fletcher wasn't merely the result of being overwhelmed, it was the consequence of a complete and utter failure to care for their daughter as she suffered physically and emotionally. The long history of isolation and neglect as the investigation unfolded, it became apparent that Lacey's isolation was not a recent development. Evidence began to suggest that her time on the couch was not merely the result of a few months of neglect, but that it had been building over a long period. Family members, friends, and acquaintances started coming forward with accounts of how Lacey had become increasingly isolated over the years. Some even recounted stories of Lacey's once active life, how she had been involved in therapy, attended school, and had been a part of the community before her family withdrew from society. One key aspect of the investigation was the realization that Lacey had not been seen outside the house for years. While her parents initially claimed that Lacey had withdrawn and refused to leave the couch, others began to question why Lacey had not received the help she needed. Mental health professionals and social services workers also pointed out that Lacey had likely been in need of significant support, both medically and socially. But the Fletchers chose not to seek external help, opting instead for a life of seclusion, which worsened Lacey's condition. What seemed to have started as an unfortunate and isolated case of neglect had now revealed itself to be a much deeper problem. Lacey's entire life had been one of increasing isolation, compounded by a lack of support from anyone outside her home. Her parents were the sole caregivers, but they had failed to see the gravity of her situation. Their refusal to engage with professionals, their unwillingness to acknowledge the need for outside intervention, and their belief that they could handle everything alone created a perfect storm of neglect. The road to justice, charges and legal proceedings as the details of Lacey's death became public. The Fletcher family's story began to fall apart. Lacey's parents were arrested and charged with second-degree murder, and the case quickly gained national attention. Many were shocked and horrified by the extent of the neglect, and the legal process that would follow was one of the most closely watched in the country. Prosecutors argued that the Fletchers had knowingly subjected Lacey to a life of misery, turning a blind eye to her physical and emotional suffering. The charges brought against Sheila and Clay Fletcher were reflective of the severity of the crime. Second-degree murder, as defined in Louisiana law, encompasses an intentional killing that occurs in the heat of passion or through gross negligence. In Lacey's case, the prosecution contended that her parents' gross negligence, combined with their long history of neglect, led directly to her death. Defense attorneys, however, sought to argue that Lacey's death was a result of the challenges of living with autism and that the parents had tried their best to care for her. The defense would attempt to frame the case as one of unfortunate circumstances and emotional distress. But the overwhelming evidence of Lacey's condition suggested otherwise. Conclusion of Part 2. The investigation into Lacey Fletcher's tragic death revealed not only the horror of her physical suffering, but also the broader issues surrounding her family's failure to care for her. It was a case marked by profound isolation, neglect, and an alarming disregard for the needs of a vulnerable individual. In the next part of this story, we will delve deeper into the legal proceedings, the trial of Sheila and Clay Fletcher, and the ultimate consequences of their actions. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the events that led to Lacey Fletcher's tragic death and the justice that followed. Part 3. The Trial and Legal Consequences. Seeking justice for Lacey Fletcher as the public outcry over the tragic death of Lacey Fletcher grew louder, the case entered its most crucial phase, the legal proceedings. The Fletchers' arrest on charges of second-degree murder signaled that justice might be on the horizon, but it also meant that their actions The years of neglect would now be dissected in a court of law. The trial that followed would not only address the specific responsibility of Sheila and Clay Fletcher, but also shine a light on the broader issues of neglect, mental health, and the failure of societal systems to protect vulnerable individuals. The legal strategy. Building the case against the Fletchers. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of shocking evidence. Lacey Fletcher's death was not the result of an isolated, unintentional act. It was the culmination of years of neglect and failure by her parents to provide the care and support she needed. The medical examiner's report detailing the extensive physical trauma caused by untreated bedsores, malnutrition, and dehydration set the stage for the prosecution's argument that Lacey's death was the direct result of gross neglect. The prosecution began by emphasizing the extreme and preventable nature of Lacey's death. They pointed to the significant physical evidence of her suffering, her atrophied limbs, her unhealed wounds, and her drastic weight loss as irrefutable signs of neglect that had gone on for far too long. They argued that Sheila and Clay Fletcher were not simply unaware of their daughter's condition. They had actively ignored the obvious signs that Lacey needed medical attention. The prosecution's strategy was not only to establish the parents' responsibility for Lacey's death, but also to prove that their actions were criminal. They contended that Lacey had been a living human being, with needs that her parents failed to meet in any meaningful way. The prosecution argued that Sheila and Clay Fletcher had allowed their daughter to suffer, and in doing so, they had committed a crime of egregious neglect. The case was complicated by the fact that Lacey was an adult at the time of her death. Some legal experts initially questioned whether neglecting an adult could be treated in the same manner as neglecting a child. However, the prosecution was determined to show that, despite Lacey's age, she was incapable of advocating for herself, and had been entirely dependent on her parents for care. The law, they argued, had to protect those who were vulnerable, regardless of their age. The defense arguments of emotional distress and mental health defense, led by Sheila and Clay Fletcher's legal team, sought to deflect responsibility and shift the focus onto the complex mental health challenges the family had faced. They argued that the Fletchers' actions, while tragic, were the result of their own emotional distress and the overwhelming challenges of caring for a child with autism. They painted a picture of a family that had tried but failed to meet Lacey's needs and suggested that the tragedy was the culmination of years of emotional and psychological strain. The defense team also brought up Lacey's own role in her isolation. They argued that, in their perception, Lacey had withdrawn from the family and refused to leave the couch, making it difficult for her parents to help her. They claimed that Lacey's refusal to engage in daily life had left Sheila and Clay unable to address her needs, and that the Fletchers had been caught in a cycle of emotional stress and frustration. The defense also suggested that Sheila and Clay had been so deeply affected by their daughter's autism and isolation that they had failed to recognize the severity of the situation. Throughout the trial, the defense presented evidence of Sheila and Clay Fletcher's troubled history, citing their own struggles with mental health, finances, and relationships. The defense sought to argue that they were not bad parents, but rather individuals who had been pushed to their breaking point by the constant challenges they faced in caring for their daughter. They suggested that their failure to intervene sooner was not the result of malice but of deep personal exhaustion and emotional exhaustion. However, the defense's arguments of emotional distress and mental health challenges were ultimately insufficient to mitigate the severity of the situation. The jury, despite acknowledging the complexity of the Fletchers' circumstances, was not swayed by the defense's arguments. The overwhelming evidence of neglect, as demonstrated by Lacey's physical condition and the testimonies of those who had known the family, made it clear that this case went far beyond what could be explained by emotional stress alone. Witness testimonies, family and friends, speak out throughout the trial. Several witnesses testified about their interactions with Sheila and Clay Fletcher, offering insights into the family dynamics that led to Lacey's isolation. Some witnesses described Sheila as a loving, albeit overwhelmed, mother who had always tried to care for her daughter. Others, however, painted a picture of a family that had withdrawn from the outside world. avoiding social interactions and avoiding help from outside resources. Friends and acquaintances who had known Lacey before her isolation expressed deep shock at the extreme transformation that had occurred over the years. They described how Lacey had once been more engaged with the world around her, attending therapy and participating in activities. But over time, these friends reported that the Fletchers had become increasingly reclusive. Lacey had not been seen outside the house for years, and when others tried to reach out, Sheila and Clay had become defensive, pushing people away. This testimony further supported the prosecution's argument that the Fletchers had chosen to isolate themselves, and their daughter, failing to seek the help that Lacey needed. Witnesses described how the Fletchers' emotional distance and refusal to acknowledge the severity of Lacey's condition were major contributing factors to the neglect that ultimately led to her death. The jury's decision: a sense of justice for Lacey. After weeks of emotional testimony, the case went to the jury for deliberation. The members of the jury were tasked with determining whether Sheila and Clay Fletcher were guilty of second-degree murder, as the prosecution argued, or whether the defense's claims of emotional distress and mental health struggles would warrant a lesser charge. Ultimately, the jury found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of second-degree murder, concluding that they had acted with gross negligence, leading to the tragic death of their daughter. The decision to convict the Fletchers sent a message that neglect and abuse, no matter how deeply embedded they may be in a family, cannot be ignored or excused. The severity of Lacey's suffering, compounded by the failure of her parents to intervene, was seen as a crime that required accountability. The jury's verdict reflected the overwhelming evidence of neglect and the need for justice to be served for a young woman who had been let down by the people who were supposed to protect her. Sentencing: the consequences of inaction. In the aftermath of the trial, the Fletcher family was faced with the consequences of their actions. Sheila and Clay were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected the brutality of their neglect and the lasting impact it had on Lacey's life. The sentencing provided some measure of justice for Lacey, but it also left a profound sense of sadness and loss for the family, friends, and community that had been affected by her tragic death. For Lacey's family, the trial and conviction were bittersweet. While they had sought justice for Lacey, nothing could undo the trauma they had experienced. Lacey's tragic story had exposed the darkest corners of family life where neglect and isolation festered in silence, and it served as a painful reminder of how crucial it is to intervene and offer support to those who are struggling. Conclusion of Part 3. The trial of Sheila and Clay Fletcher marked a turning point in the case of Lacey Fletcher's tragic death. Through the court proceedings, the full extent of the neglect she had suffered was revealed, and the Fletchers were held accountable for their actions. While the conviction of second-degree murder brought justice for Lacey, the emotional toll of the case will linger for years to come. In Part 4, we will examine the broader societal and systemic issues raised by Lacey Fletcher's death, from the failure of social systems to protect vulnerable individuals to the conversation about mental health and neglect. Lacey's story has ignited important discussions about the need for better support for families and individuals in crisis. Stay with us as we continue to reflect on the lessons learned from this heart-wrenching case. Part 4. The Aftermath. Addressing the systemic failures and society's response to the tragic death of Lacey Fletcher sent shockwaves through the small town of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and across the nation. While the legal consequences for Sheila and Clay Fletcher provided some form of closure, Lacey's case raised critical questions about the systems that failed to protect her. It underscored deep concerns about the need for better mental health resources, the importance of early intervention in cases of neglect, and the responsibility of communities and social services to step in when a vulnerable person is at risk. In this final section, we will explore the aftermath of Lacey's death, focusing on the societal and systemic issues that have come to light and the lasting impact her story has had on both her community and the nation. The systemic failures, a call for change in social services. Lacey Fletcher's death highlighted several failures in the system that was supposed to protect her. As an adult, Lacey fell through the cracks of a system that did not adequately support her or her family. Despite her struggles with autism and her dependency on her parents, there was no intervention from social services or mental health professionals that could have prevented her isolation and suffering. Lacey had been known to the state's Department of Children and Family Services (DCFS) when she was younger, and it was clear that her parents had never fully addressed the severity of her needs. While many people in her life had expressed concerns about her well-being, there was no consistent monitoring or support system in place to ensure she received the proper care. The question remains, why didn't the system intervene earlier? The lack of communication and coordination between various agencies and the lack of proactive measures to monitor at-risk individuals like Lacey is one of the most glaring issues in this case. Had there been more frequent home visits by social workers or more active engagement by community health services, the warning signs of severe neglect might have been caught earlier. Lacey's isolation, worsening physical condition, and failure to thrive were all indicative of neglect that should have been addressed much sooner. Social workers, educators, medical professionals, and mental health providers all have a responsibility to notice the signs of neglect and to act when they see warning signs of abuse or neglect. In Lacey's case, the lack of communication between these individuals and the authorities contributed to a system failure that led to her untimely death. This raises serious questions about the responsibility of healthcare providers, schools, and local agencies to intervene when an individual's life is in danger. The incident has sparked calls for reform in how at-risk individuals, particularly those with disabilities, are cared for and monitored. Many experts suggest that more robust mental health services should be available to families and individuals facing significant challenges. Families who struggle with severe emotional or psychological burdens should not be left to navigate their crises alone, and communities must provide better safety nets to support them before tragedies like Lacey's death occur. A national conversation, mental health, and the need for early intervention. The Fletcher case has ignited a broader conversation about mental health, disability, and the profound neglect of vulnerable individuals within families. Mental health professionals and advocates for those with disabilities have argued that families in crisis should have access to better resources and support. As awareness of Lacey's story spreads, many are calling for increased access to mental health services, both at the community and state levels. To help prevent similar tragedies, Lacey Fletcher's death underscores the importance of identifying warning signs of neglect and intervening early. Her case exposes how untreated mental health struggles and the lack of community support for individuals and families can have devastating consequences. Many experts believe that early intervention programs, where trained professionals assess the needs of families, could help prevent cases of extreme neglect from reaching the point of death. The failure to address mental health concerns earlier in Lacey's life speaks to a much larger problem within the healthcare and social service systems. People with mental illnesses or disabilities often face barriers when trying to access the care they need. They may feel isolated and overwhelmed by their personal challenges, and if they do not have strong support systems in place, they are at risk of becoming invisible to society. Lacey's death is a reminder of how crucial it is for the mental health system to provide proactive care, offering assistance and regular check-ins for families dealing with difficult circumstances. Additionally, Lacey's case has raised awareness about the need for better training for healthcare providers and social workers on how to identify and respond to signs of neglect and abuse in families. Professionals who interact with vulnerable individuals must be equipped to notice red flags and take immediate action when necessary. The role of the community, awareness, and prevention. While Sheila and Clay Fletcher's failure to care for Lacey is undoubtedly at the heart of this tragedy, the response of the community is another significant aspect of the story. The Fletcher family was known to have isolated themselves from neighbors, friends, and other community members. According to some reports, the Fletchers rarely interacted with others and were reluctant to accept help or advice from those around them. This isolation, compounded by their inability or unwillingness to seek assistance, allowed the neglect to continue unchecked. The story of Lacey Fletcher serves as a painful reminder that communities must be vigilant when it comes to supporting their most vulnerable members. It is not enough to assume that families will always seek help when they need it. Sometimes, the most well-meaning individuals can fail to ask for assistance, either out of shame, fear, or sheer exhaustion. The community, whether through friends, neighbors, or local organizations, has a responsibility to look out for one another. Lacey's case has sparked efforts within local communities to foster better relationships and communication between families and neighbors, as well as between individuals and the social services system. There are calls for greater community involvement in monitoring the well-being of residents, especially those who are disabled, elderly, or dealing with mental health issues, by creating an environment where neighbors are encouraged to look out for each other. The risk of severe neglect or abuse can be mitigated. Several organizations that work with people with disabilities and mental health challenges are also using Lacey's story to advocate for community-based programs that support families before problems escalate. These programs would focus on providing education, respite care, and regular check-ins for families struggling to care for loved ones with special needs. Early intervention and regular monitoring would ensure that families receive the support they need and prevent isolation from taking hold. Lacey Fletcher's legacy, raising awareness and preventing future tragedies despite the heartbreaking nature of her death. Lacey's story has become a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups and mental health organizations are using her case to highlight the gaps in the system and raise awareness about the importance of preventing neglect and providing support to families in need. The tragedy has sparked national conversations about the importance of strengthening policies related to the care of vulnerable individuals, particularly those with disabilities. Public campaigns aimed at improving the identification and reporting of neglect have gained traction. As more people recognize that preventing abuse and neglect requires a societal shift toward empathy, awareness, and early intervention. Lacey's story has also become a rallying cry for families who have experienced similar struggles. Many individuals with disabilities or mental health conditions, and their families, have spoken out about the difficulties they face when trying to access resources, support, and care. Lacey's death has made it clear that more must be done to provide meaningful help to individuals who are at risk of neglect or abuse. Her story serves as a tragic reminder of how vulnerable people can be when they lack the support they need to navigate the complexities of life. But her legacy is also one of hope. Hope that by sharing her story, others will be empowered to speak out, seek help, and ensure that no one is left to suffer in silence. Conclusion: a lasting impact on families, communities, and the legal system. The case of Lacey Fletcher has had a profound impact on her family, the community of Baton Rouge, and the broader conversation about the treatment of individuals with disabilities. The systemic failures, the emotional and physical neglect, and the societal apathy that allowed this tragedy to unfold have ignited a call for reform and change. While justice has been served through the legal consequences for Sheila and Clay Fletcher, the work of addressing the underlying issues that led to Lacey's suffering is far from over. Her case serves as a painful reminder that society must do better to protect its most vulnerable members, particularly those who cannot advocate for themselves. Through greater awareness, early intervention, and community support, it is possible to prevent future tragedies like Lacey Fletcher's death. Her legacy is not only one of sorrow, but also one of hope and inspiration for change, a call to action for society to be more compassionate, vigilant, and proactive in caring for those who need it the most. Lacey Fletcher's tragic story has left an indelible mark on those who have followed the case, and it serves as a stark reminder of the need for vigilance, compassion, and accountability in our society. This heartbreaking story has sparked important conversations about mental health, caregiving responsibilities, and the failure of systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals. Now, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the events surrounding Lacey's death? How do you think we can better support individuals who are isolated or in need of proper care? What changes do you believe are necessary to ensure that a tragedy like this never happens again? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this critical discussion. It's time to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are never neglected again, and that people are held accountable for the well-being of those in their care. If Lacey's story has impacted you, we encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to Room 57. Your engagement helps spread awareness about these important topics, and we're committed to bringing more stories that shed light on the dark corners of human society. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay informed, stay compassionate, and let's work together to create a world where people like Lacey are protected and cared for. Not forgotten. Thank you for being part of the conversation.